Hey there, guitar fanatics. I'm just going to dive right in and say it. I don't think you need to spend the time to learn the CAGED system. I think you'll learn guitar faster, better, and more permanently if you learn the fundamentals of music and apply those to learning the guitar. You know, CAGED is sort of an artificial construct. I've always been confused by the idea if you're trying to learn something that already exists like music theory, how repackaging just a small part of it, adding some extra overlays and coming up with a catchy acronym, how somehow that's going to make it easier. Now, the CAGED system seems to be the third rail of guitar instruction, if you will. And I know there's a lot of you out there that have probably learned it. And it may have really helped you and you might love it. And if that's the case, that's great. However, I encounter a lot of guitar players that are looking for a magic bullet, an all-in-one solution to learning the guitar. And they seem to be under the impression that the CAGED system is that solution. But frankly, what it teaches you is really limited, and at the very best, it's incomplete. If you really want to improve your understanding of the guitar and how music works, I need you to keep an open mind and give me a few minutes. This lesson has the potential to revolutionize the way that you see the guitar and the fretboard and to make you a much better musician and guitar player. I'm Charlie Long. Let's play some guitar. So that example I just played, if I was to break it down and analyze it, there are licks in there that are made up of multiple techniques that people might say come from some sort of a system. There were 3-note per string patterns. There was a scale pattern in there that some people would say came out of the CAGED system. But there were also chromatics, triads, fragments of the pentatonic scale, an example of a melodic cell. And there were chords that used extensions like ninths and elevenths. And it all fit together seamlessly. Now here's an argument I see all the time. Hey, I saw you play the D shape at the 5th fret. You're using CAGED. Well, that D shape is a very usable triad shape that I play all the time. But I guarantee you, when I'm playing it, I'm not thinking about CAGED. And that lick I played as an example, I can promise you, I wasn't thinking about any kind of a system when I was playing it. I was simply thinking about a chord change from D minor to G minor and letting the ideas flow. And yeah, I can do that because I've been playing for decades. But I can also do it because I was lucky enough to have teachers that focused on teaching me the fundamentals of music and how to apply that to the guitar, and many different ways of playing these ideas without having to think about making them fit into some sort of system. Let me tell you what I'm not trying to do with this video. I'm not trying to make anyone angry or insult anyone. For some reason, if you say something that could be perceived as negative about certain guitar-related subjects, people react as if you'd insulted their mother or told them that their girlfriend's ugly. I've seen very well-intentioned, courteous videos by the biggest of the big-name YouTubers suggesting that there might be a better way to learn than CAGED, and they just get flamed in the comments by people that I guess would rather argue than practice. I'm not interested in that. I'm also not trying to be controversial, and yes, there are guitar teachers out there that make videos bashing CAGED just so they can post some clickbait in a hope of gaining a little notoriety. What I am trying to do with this video is share from my perspective of decades of playing, studying, and teaching what has worked best for me and the people that I've worked with. I want to try to show you that something that may seem very simple on the surface might not only be incomplete, but it might be adding a layer of unnecessary complexity. I'm also going to try to convince you to keep an open mind about learning the good, really fundamental stuff and putting in the work, as opposed to seeking out gimmicks and shortcuts. So some of you might be asking, well, what is the CAGED system anyway? Well, it's a way of helping people organize the fretboard by taking 5 chord forms that we typically learn in the open position when we get started: C, A, G, E, and D, altering the fingerings of those chords to turn them into bar chords, and then moving them up and down the neck. I'll go through this and try to relate each of these chord forms to the key of C, starting with the C chord form down in the open position, I can move that up to the 12th fret, and I get what we refer to as a C shape at the 12th fret. I could take this A chord form, using my first finger as kind of a capo. I could move to the 3rd fret where I've got a C in the root. Now I've got what we would call the A shape of C. If I take a G chord, and again, sort of using my first finger as a capo at the 5th fret, and using this slightly awkward chord voicing, I can make a chord that we would call the G shape of C, with the root there at the 8th fret. If I take an E chord, and again, I use my first finger as a capo, move up to the 8th fret, we play this 6-string bar chord form that's pretty familiar. And then lastly, I take the D chord, I've got a C note as the root at the 10th fret, so again, my first finger's a capo, and I play our familiar D shape up here at the 12th fret. So that is our 5 caged shapes, relating them to C and then moving them up the fretboard. And if we want to delve a little deeper, we can overlay the 5 pentatonic box patterns and 5 major scale patterns onto these chord shapes. But here's some problems that spring to mind immediately. I think a lot of guitarists think that learning these shapes absolves them from having to learn the notes on the fretboard. But to move these bar chord forms around into different keys, you're first going to have to memorize which notes in the chord forms are the root notes. And then you've got to know your notes on the fretboard well enough to play the chords in the proper positions for a particular key. And the root notes can be on different strings, so you're going to have to learn the fretboard anyway. Number 2, simply memorizing a chord shape, well, it doesn't teach you anything about the notes in that shape or how that chord is constructed. Now, all 5 of the caged chord shapes are basically triads. There may be more than 3 notes, but these are chords that are made up of a root, a 3rd interval, and a 5th interval, and they're all major chords. You need to know which note is which if you want to come up with different inversions in your own chord voicings, which leads me to my next point. You'll almost never see an accomplished player using some of these caged chord voicings like that. I've never used that chord. They're more like placeholders to allow you to identify different areas on the fretboard than they are usable chord forms. But caged itself, well, it doesn't teach you any music theory, so you're going to struggle to turn them into usable chord forms, and you're still going to need supplemental materials like chord charts or books on chord construction. Point number 4, how about minor chords, 7th chords, chords with extensions like ninths, flat fifths, or sharp 11ths. You know, even articles I've seen that are absolutely hailing the CAGED system mention that ultimately you're going to have to learn intervals, you're going to have to learn how to manipulate those intervals and how to alter chord shapes. None of this information is inherently found in CAGED. Point number 5, what's really troubling to me is when I hear people start trying to tie scale shapes to the 5 caged chord forms. And they start using phrases like the 5 pentatonic shapes or the 5 major scale shapes. First of all, there are many, many different ways to play different scales. There is no the scale shape or even the 5 scale shapes. There are scale formulas and those are absolute, but there are so many different ways to play them. This is maybe the most limiting aspect of CAGED, the idea that there's this tiny number of ways to play scales. Point number 6, speaking of scales, would you think I was nuts if I said to you, hey, play the E-flat Phrygian mode by playing the B-flat scale form of B-flat? Or how about play the F Lydian mode by playing the A scale shape of C? It sounds kind of crazy, right? And this is totally at the heart of what I said earlier about not understanding how adding extra overlays and constructs to something that already perfectly exists can make it easier. Wouldn't it be far more simple to just learn the scales from their roots? And if you're thinking of the F Lydian mode as the A scale shape of C, do you even know what F Lydian is all about anyway? Point number 7, since CAGED only focuses on major chords and scales and doesn't really teach you anything about music theory, what happens when you get to the point you want to learn other scales like harmonic minor or melodic minor? You're still going to have to learn music theory. You're going to have to learn scale formulas and intervals. So why not get used to learning those properly from the start? Let me stop here and say what's good about CAGED is it's an introduction to some people to start thinking about how to connect the fretboard. and it introduces the concept that chords and scales have a relationship. So for a lot of folks, it might be a very good place to start. But ultimately, you're still going to have to supplement this with a lot more learning. And it just seems to me there are other things that you could learn instead that are going to give you a much more solid base of fundamental understanding right from the get-go. Of course, me saying that leads to, okay, Charlie, what should we learn instead? Well, let me start by giving you a little pep talk. You can do this. Music theory isn't hard, but I see a lot of very intelligent, very accomplished adults just shut their mind off when the subject comes up. If you can recite the alphabet from A to G and you can count to 7, you can understand the theory behind the major scale. And if you can look at a sequence of letters or numbers and pick out every other letter or number in the sequence, you can understand how chords are built. So let's get into a few musical concepts that I think will be far more beneficial to you than learning CAGED. And we'll even talk about how to practice them to really move your playing forward. Concept number 1 is the major scale. I think some of the most important theory you can learn and everyone should learn is how the major scale is constructed. Each scale has a formula of how its notes are spaced out, and that formula is specific to that scale. The major scale, if we look at it on one string, and we're going to use C major because there aren't any sharps or flats. Well, there's C, which is the root note or the tonic or the 1, and I'm at the 3rd fret of the A string. If I move up 2 frets, or what we call a whole step, we have D, or the 2nd. If I move up 2 more frets to the 7th fret, I've got E, which is the major 3rd interval in the key of C. Moving up 1 fret or a half step, we have F, which is the 4th. If I move up 2 more frets, I've got a G at the 10th fret of the A string, and that is the 5th in the key of C. 2 more frets from there, we've got A, which is the 6th. Moving up 2 frets from there, we have a B, which is the major 7th. And then 1 fret up from the major 7th, we have our root again, up an octave from where we started. So the formula for the major scale, if we talk about the spaces between the notes, we start at the root, we move a whole step, we move another whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and a half step. And that works for any key, any root that we start on. If we started on E flat and we go through our formula, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Well, there's E flat major. Okay, you with me so far? Let's go to our second concept. Concept number 2 is learning third intervals. If you really want to understand how chords are built, and if you want to dramatically improve not only your ear, but your ability to move around the fretboard, third intervals are a great thing to learn. If we go back to our scale and we start on C, which we'll call 1, D would be 2, and E would be the 3rd note that we come to. So we call C to E a third interval. And to be more specific, C and E are 4 frets apart, or what we call 2 whole steps. And we call that relationship a major third. Now let's start on the D note and call that 1. E would be 2, F is the 3rd note we come to. So D and F are also a 3rd interval apart. But notice that they're only 3 frets apart on the fretboard. Now getting specific, we call that a minor third. If we look at thirds on 2 strings rather than 1 string, 2 strings that sit side by side, we can see we've got a C at the 8th fret and an E at the 7th fret. That's what a major third looks like on every set of 2 strings except the G and B due to the tuning of the B string. So I've got a major third on the E and A, on the A and D, on the D and G. Then I get to the C and E on the B and high E string. On the G and B strings, C and E are on the same frets, like here at fret 5. So that's what a major third looks like there. How about D and F, a minor third? Well, D is at the 10th fret, F is at the 8th fret. So they're 2 frets apart, except again on the G and B string. And as we can see here, we've got D at the 7th fret and F at the 6th fret. So there's a 1 fret difference between the notes on the GB string set opposed to the 2 frets everywhere else. Now, if we explore the thirds of the entire key, they have a very specific order and a set of characteristics. C and E is a major third. D and F is minor. E and G is minor. F and A is major. G and B is major. A and C, well, that's a minor third. B and D is a minor third. And then we're back to our octave. So these 7 thirds comprise the first 2 notes of each of the 7 triads and 7th chords in a key, which again makes me scratch my head a little at the idea of spending time learning a system that's made up only of major chords. Now you should practice these thirds until you get really smooth at moving them up and down the fretboards on every set of 2 strings. And we want to get to where we can play not only horizontally up and down the neck on a set of 2 strings, we want to be able to move across the fretboard staying in one position. And now that we got 2-part harmony covered, let's go on and move into 3-part harmony. The third fretboard concept that I think is absolutely essential for learning is learning triad shapes all over the neck. And learning triads is a natural step after learning third intervals. Because to make a triad, we're just stacking 2 third intervals on top of one another. Learning triads is a fantastic way to learn the neck of the guitar, and they're essential tools for not only soloing, but for playing good rhythm guitar. And I am going to take a jab at CAGED here because it teaches 5 different shapes of 1 major chord. But in a major key, there are actually 7 different triads, 3 different kinds of triads. This is why I say that CAGED is incomplete and you're probably better off learning more fundamental information right from the start. Let's take a look at some of what we call root form triad shapes that span 3 strings. Now on the EAD and the ADG string sets, major triads look like this. I've got a root, I've got major third, and a 5th. On the D, G, and B strings, we have this shape. Root, 3rd, 5th, and on the G, B, and E strings, we have this shape, root, 3rd, 5th. How about minor triads, which is something CAGED doesn't even touch on? To get a minor triad, we're going to take our major triad, which had the intervals root, major third, and 5th, and we're going to flatten that major third 1 fret. And now we call that a minor third, and you can hear how the sound goes from happy to sad. Now, on the E, A, and D, and the A, D, and G strings, minor thirds look like this. On the D, G, and B, they look like this. And the G, B, and E, we have this shape. Lastly, the triad built off the 7th note in a key is diminished. On the E, A, and D, and the A, D, and G strings, diminished triad looks like this. On the D, G, and B string, it looks like this. And on G, B, and E, we have this shape. And like the third intervals, the order of the triads in a key is major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, and we're back to major. And we want to be able to play them horizontally up and down the neck like that, or again, stay in one general area and go vertically across the neck. Again, compare the amount of music we're making here, playing through the entire scale in 3-part harmony to learning 5 chord shapes of a major chord from CAGED. And we can go on from here to learn what we call inversions of triads, which are just shapes that start on a different note other than the root. And from there, you're pretty much unstoppable as far as your ability to move around the neck and play all kinds of great rhythm parts and soloing concepts. Fretboard concept number 4 is mapping out the rest of the intervals in the scale as they relate to the root. I am thrilled to see how much of an emphasis there is today by many, many great players on learning intervals as opposed to just blindly playing through scale shapes. How I'd like you to practice and study this is to pick a root note, and today we're using C, and we're going to build out this fretboard map in two ways. The first way is by playing the root note with the index finger of the fretting hand. The other way is to play the root note with the pinky finger of your fretting hand. So starting with our index finger on the C at the 8th fret of the low E string, well, we know D, or the 2, is 2 frets or a whole step above our root. E, or the major third, is 2 frets above the second. F, or the 4th, is over on the A string right across from the root, same fret. G is going to be 2 frets above the 4th. G is the 5th, and we play the root and G together and we get a power chord. A, or the 6th, is going to be 2 frets above the 5th. B, or the major 7, is going to be at the 9th fret of the D string. And the major 7 is always 1 fret below the octave. So there's our C, or the octave, at the 10th fret. Now, looking at our diagram, I noticed several things that are useful. The 4th, it's on the same fret as the root. The 5th is 1 string over and 2 frets up. Like I said, there's our power chord. The octave is going to be over 2 strings and up 2 frets from the root, and then the major 7 is always a half step below that octave. So these are the things that you want to try to notice and key on and really burn into your brain as you're trying to learn the fretboard. How about starting with our pinky on the root? Just for reference, we already said that the major 7th is always 1 fret below the root. And we'd have the 6th 2 frets below that. But on the E and A strings, the 2nd is going to be 1 string over and 3 frets down from the root. We've got the major 3rd up 2 frets from the 2nd. We know that the 4th is on the same fret as our root. G, or the 5th, is going to be on the D string, but on the same fret as the 2nd. The 6th is on the same fret as the major 3rd. 2 frets above the 6th is our major 7th. And lastly, we've got our octave. It's over on the G string at the 5th fret. So this is just a start with intervals and scale shapes. There are so many ways to play scale patterns, but it's awesome practice to find C notes all over the fretboard and to be able to play the major scale with at least your index finger or your pinky on the root. For instance, here we are at the 8th string like we were practicing. That was index finger, here's pinky. What if we go up to the C on the 15th fret of the A string? Index finger, here's pinky. How about the C at the 10th fret of the D string? Index finger, pinky. And why such an emphasis on intervals? Because once you know these basics, if you hear somebody say something like, well, the Lydian mode is just a major scale with a sharp 4th interval, you're going to know exactly what that means. And as this knowledge builds, the learning curve associated with learning new things, well, it's going to get shorter and shorter. So that's my take on CAGED and some ideas about concepts that I think might serve you better. Now, if you really want to do a deep dive into major scale theory, I suggest you watch this video. It goes far more in depth and has a lot more practice ideas. And as always, I wish you the very best with your guitar playing, and I'll be seeing you soon. Bye.